What if the very betrayal that broke you was actually God's first step in building you? Joseph wasn't just the dreamer in the pit. He was the blueprint in motion. Sold, forgotten, falsely accused. Yet every injustice moved him closer to the throne God prepared. This isn't just about survival. It's about revelation. That every delay, betrayal, and detour was a tool in God's hands. Your pain might still speak, but what if it's trying to say something holy? This is the story of Joseph, and the story of how your deepest wounds may become your greatest witness. Stay with me. This one could change everything. When betrayal becomes the stage for redemption. Some stories begin with suffering and end in victory, but Joseph's begins in betrayal. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, left for dead, thrown into a foreign culture, accused without cause, forgotten in prison. Yet every moment of seeming abandonment was part of a far greater design. This section opens the door into a story that feels too familiar. When betrayal hurts deepest and hope is furthest away, God may be writing what we cannot yet see. I can still remember the first time I read the story of Joseph as an adult, long after Sunday school drawings had reduced him to a kid in a colorful coat. Back then, I knew the outline. Special coat, jealous brothers, thrown into a pit, Egypt, dream interpreter, second in command, family restored. But what jolted me later, what made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, was not the coat or the dreams, but the sequence of suffering. Each dishonored moment became a doorway into destiny. Joseph's life was a tapestry woven on the loom of betrayal, abandonment, false accusation, delay, and isolation. And for those of us who have ever looked at our own pain and wondered, why is this happening to me? His story reaches deep into the unspoken places of our soul. His brothers didn't just dislike him, they hated him. They envied his dreams. They resented his favor. They envied his identity. Their betrayal was not casual. It was calculated. When they cast him into the cistern and sold him to Midianite traders, they assumed they had ripped him out of the story entirely. But betrayal in human hands is often preparation in divine hands. Pause for a moment. Have you ever felt thrown into a cistern of life? Left in a place that feels dark, damp, and forgotten? Have you ever walked through a pit of confusion, wondering if anyone would ever hear your voice again? That's where Joseph's story begins. Not in triumph, but in the gut-wrenching experience of being put aside by those he loved. And yet, within the very pit that held him, there was a narrative being written that he could not yet see. He was taken to Egypt, not as a welcome guest, but as a slave. And slavery in Egypt was not a casual job assignment. It was bondage. A place stripped of identity, a place of emptying, a place where dreams go dry. It was there in that foreign land that Joseph was bought by Potiphar, a captain of Pharaoh's guard, a man of influence, power, and prestige, whose household became Joseph's first place of work in a world that was not his own. But even in servitude, shadows of betrayal followed him. Falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, Joseph was thrown into prison. Again, isolated, misunderstood, unseen. Forgotten by everyone who once smiled on his youthful dreams. Delay piled on delay, darkness piled on darkness. And still, Joseph held on to something invisible. Something internal that no betrayal could take. A steadfast soul anchored in a deep belief that his suffering was not the end of his story. This truth that betrayal and suffering can coexist with purpose is one of the hardest spiritual realities to accept. We want life to make sense in real time. We want justice delivered immediately. We want betrayal exposed, accounted for, and rectified in the moment. But Joseph's life shows us something far greater. What feels like abandonment may be the ground where destiny is being formed. Joseph didn't just survive each blow, he advanced through them. Even in prison beneath chains and obscurity, he interpreted dreams with clarity, spoke truth with courage, and became known as someone God could trust with insight. And what's fascinating is that Joseph's spiritual gifts did not emerge in comfort. They emerged in confinement. Have you noticed that many of your gifts surfaced when your safety was gone? When your confidence was shaken? When your identity fell apart? What if the very soil of your suffering was fertile ground for your calling? This is the paradox that Joseph himself finally understood. Years later, when he stood before his brothers who had betrayed him and said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." That moment is not redemption alone. It's revelation. It's the moment when Joseph perceives what was happening beneath the surface of pain. Every pit, every prison, every trial was part of a trajectory that led not just to restoration, but to the salvation of many. And that turns his story into more than biography. It becomes a mirror for all of us who have ever felt betrayed, abandoned, overlooked, or misused. Because Joseph's life refuses a simplistic formula like betrayal to hurt to recovery. His life reveals the deeper arc, betrayal to transformation to kingdom impact. And that's why his story is both ancient and achingly contemporary. It speaks to the places inside us that long for meaning beneath the pain. It calls us to ask not only what is happening to me, but what might God be preparing in me through what is happening to me? So this journey we're about to take isn't just another historical retelling. It's a pilgrimage into the hidden terrain where loss, loyalty, betrayal, and divine purpose collide. And it begins with this. What if your greatest wound is actually an appointment with your destiny? When suffering isn't the end, it's the blueprint for becoming. Joseph's life wasn't a random sequence of bad breaks. It was a carefully wound narrative, where betrayal, exile, character, and destiny intersected in ways he couldn't see at the time. This section unpacks the spiritual architecture beneath his journey, how betrayal became formation, delay became preparation, and suffering became purpose. When we think about Joseph, we often remember the dramatic moments: the pit, the prison, the coat of many colors, the rise to power. But those scenes are merely the surface. Beneath them runs a deep current, a structural design that turns pain into preparation, brokenness into fruitfulness, and betrayal into blueprint. If Joseph's story is a house, the outward events are only the visible walls. The true strength lies in the foundation. The first core theme we encounter in Joseph's life is deferred arrival. God does not rescue Joseph instantly from the cistern. He is not spared hard labor in Egypt. He is not preserved from false accusation. Instead, everything happens in stages of delay. In our spiritual narratives, we often assume that good people get good outcomes fast. But Joseph's arc rewrites that assumption. His rise does not follow his suffering. His rise unfolds through it. Delay becomes the workshop where character is forged. Have you ever felt stuck in a place where you know you belong somewhere else, yet you remain? What if the waiting isn't a delay of purpose, but a phase of preparation for what's coming? A second theme woven through Joseph's life is identity formation amidst abandonment. His brothers rejected him. Potiphar's wife used him. The prison system forgot him. Who was Joseph when no one saw him? What remained true about him when his status was stripped away? Joseph's identity was not anchored in his father's favor, his coat, or even his dreams. It was anchored in a divine promise that he continued to carry inwardly even when it felt as though everything around him contradicted it. The real miracle in his life isn't that Joseph interpreted dreams. It's that he continued to dream. Most people abandon dreams when betrayal feels too sharp and waiting too long. They lose confidence, forget the whisper of promise, and settle for less than what destiny intended. But Joseph walked through every betrayal holding on to something unseen. This brings us to another core concept: the power of inner witness. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams was not just a gift. It was a symptom of his connection to God's voice. While in prison, the dreams he interpreted for others came true. This was not merely a spiritual party trick. It was a reminder every time his gift operated, that God's presence was still with him. In the depths of abandonment, he carried a witness of God within him. That internal testimony is one of the most overlooked spiritual truths in Scripture. You may lose external support, but you can never lose what God has placed in your spirit. What witness do you carry inside you that the world hasn't yet acknowledged? What truth about your life is still true, even when nothing in your circumstance reflects it? A fourth theme is redemptive memory rather than resentful recollection. When Joseph's brothers finally stand before him in Egypt, years after selling him into slavery, he does not respond in bitterness. Instead, he speaks the most profound line of his entire life. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph did not forget the betrayal. He reframed it. He remembered not the act of cruelty itself, but the divine hand that worked through it toward a greater purpose. This is the crux of spiritual maturity, not denial of pain, but transcendence through it. Joseph does not say, "What they did was right." He says, "God used what was wrong to fulfill something greater." That nuance is deeper than platitudes. It requires seeing suffering as a material in the workshop of God, not as the end of the story. Can you look at your own broken places and begin to see not merely the injury, but the formation? Another core theme, one that resonates with discipleship today, is the integrity of obedience even when the outcome is unknown. Joseph could have given in to despair, resentment, or self-pity at multiple points. But in Potiphar's house, in prison, and even when elevated to power, he remained faithful to what he believed God called him to be. The narrative makes it clear. His strength was not in his position, but in his positioning. Always aligned with God's intent, even when circumstances felt misaligned. In the everyday world, this calls us to examine our own posture when life doesn't make sense. Are we serving with integrity when no one is looking? Are we faithful in the unseen moments that shape reputation and character? Joseph's story carries another timbre. That leadership born from suffering carries empathy for others in pain. When famine struck and his brothers came to Egypt seeking food, Joseph didn't immediately condemn them. Instead, he provided. He saw in their hunger what his own heart knew intimately: the ache of desperation, the humility of need, the ache of belonging. This is the hallmark of kingdom leadership. Not the ability to judge, but the capacity to restore. Are your gifts and influence eventually turned outward for the benefit of others, especially those who once hurt you? The spiritual blueprints in Joseph's narrative converge here. Delayed purpose. Identity anchored to God rather than circumstance. A witness that does not shrink under pressure, and obedience that outlives confusion. And that brings us to a potent insight. God's blueprint often looks like betrayal before it looks like victory, because breakthrough always carries the weight of transformation. Joseph's life teaches us that hurt is not lost when it's held by God. It becomes material for destiny, the pit, the palace, and the pattern of providence. Joseph's story isn't a random collection of incidents. It's a tightly woven tapestry of imagery and meaning. Behind every betrayal and every exaltation lies a symbolic architecture. That teaches us how God shapes people through what seems like chaos. This section unveils those deeper layers. In the narrative of Joseph, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. The mundane becomes meaningful, and every twist of fate carries a symbolic echo of a greater spiritual pattern. The very first image. The pit is not merely a convenience of plot. It becomes one of the most enduring symbols in Scripture, the place of abandonment, where God begins to reveal himself most vividly. Think about a pit, a place cut off from light, a hole in the ground where dignity falls and hope shrinks. It is not a sleeping place. It is not a resting place. It is a place of desperation. And yet, ironically, it becomes the first landmark in a story about destiny. When Joseph is thrown into that cistern by his brothers, the world believes he has met his end. But in that depth, something unseen begins to rise in him, a recognition that God walks with us, not just in palaces, but in pits. And that's the first emotional symbol, the pit of betrayal as a birthplace of faith. Have you ever been brought low, and in that emptiness felt something unnamed stir within you? The pit doesn't represent doom alone. It represents referral from human expectation to divine reliance. Then there is the image of the coat of many colors, the tangible symbol of Father's favor. It's not just flashy attire, it's outward sign of identity, love, and promise. When that coat is ripped from Joseph's body and dipped into blood, it becomes a symbol of distorted identity. What we think we are in the eyes of others becoming nowhere near what we truly are in the sight of God. The brothers use that coat to prove Joseph is dead, but God uses that symbol of death to push Joseph further into life. There is something deep here about symbols that appear to mean one thing, but actually mean another. A kind of spiritual optical illusion that Joseph's life keeps repeating. His dreams, those early nocturnal visions of sheaves bowing and stars bowing, were symbols too. Not simple fortune-telling, but prophetic signs of relational reversal and future authority. Joseph's dreams were coded invitations to trust what your eyes haven't yet seen. A theme that will echo throughout the biblical text, culminating in other moments where physical reality seems to contradict spiritual promise. What dreams in your life feel distant, impossible, or even mocked right now, yet might be part of a divine pattern you can't fully see yet? Then comes the palace, not just a place of power, but a symbolic reversal of the pit. Where the cistern was a place of abandonment, the palace becomes a place of approval. Where the pit was cold and dark, the throne chamber is warm and commanding. When Joseph walks onto the stage of Pharaoh's court, a foreigner with no credentials, he is a visual puzzle to everyone around him. But symbolically, his rise is not an anomaly. It is the manifestation of a dream given on the brink of despair and kept alive through years of obedience. The palace then becomes more than a literal location. It becomes the symbol of restored identity, the transformation of one who was lost into one who is found. It represents the theological truth that God's elevation is not the world's elevation. Pharaoh's hallways are crowded with human authority, but Joseph's authority is rooted in divine calling. But the symbolic narrative doesn't stop there. It goes deeper, into the emotional geography of forgiveness and reconciliation. When Joseph's brothers stand before him in Egypt, they do not recognize the man they betrayed. Joseph does. And he chooses to conceal his identity not out of malice, but to reveal God's pattern of redemption first. There is a symbolic shift here, from self-defense to self-sacrifice, from identity as victim to identity as savior, from resentment to restoration. When Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers with the monumental line, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good," he is not simply forgiving them. He is reading life diagonally instead of literally. He is seeing life through God's authorial intent rather than through human damage. His heart has ascended from hurt to horizon. When you look at your own betrayals, do you see the damage alone? Or can you, like Joseph, see the invisible threads that might be drawing something beautiful from something painful? Finally, the story's repeated movement, from pit to palace, from slave to sovereign, from betrayal to blessing, symbolizes the larger biblical motif of reversal. The weak become strong, the last become first, the broken become bearers of blessing. It's a cosmic narrative pattern that Joseph models for us, that suffering is not wasted when it is lived in covenant with God. The pit, the palace, the dreams, the coat, the forgiveness. These are not random images. They are spiritual waymarkers that tell us how to live when life doesn't look like blessing yet. They remind us that the real blueprint of God's providence often looks like betrayal before it looks like blessing. Not because God delights in pain, but because purpose cannot be forged without it. And this symbolism woven into every twist of Joseph's journey becomes a mirror for our own. When betrayal shapes you before your purpose can use you. Joseph's story is more than biblical history. It's a living mirror. The same patterns that shaped his life echo in our own. Betrayal, delay, misunderstanding, and unexpected elevation. This section looks at how these ancient themes play out today, in careers, relationships, identity, and leadership. We often think of betrayal as a wound, something that injures and then stays in the past. But Joseph's life teaches us that betrayal can also be formation. The pit was not just a failure point. It was the beginning of his training ground. Far from being outside of God's plan, every moment of Joseph's suffering took place within the architecture of God's design. Even though Joseph didn't see it at the time, in real life this calls for a shift in the way we interpret pain. Too often we ask, "Why me?" as though suffering is a detour from blessing instead of the front door into it. Joseph's answer to that question, though unspoken at the time, wasn't that suffering was good, but that God used it for purpose. There's deep practical application in that for all of us. Betrayal doesn't cancel destiny. It often clears the path for it. In contemporary life, betrayal looks like layoffs, broken friendships, exclusion from circles, divorce, unfair judgment, and rejection. But Joseph's story invites us to pause and consider that these moments, painful as they are, may be the very soil where God grows something you never could have grown in comfort. When you've been pushed out, ignored, or underestimated, what did you learn in that place that you couldn't have learned anywhere else? Because Joseph became an interpreter of dreams in prison, not in the palace. His insight was sharpened where his identity was least visible. This has powerful implications. Your greatest gifts may awaken not where you are affirmed, but where you are abandoned. This means that preparation for your purpose often happens in places where people don't see you. That's a spiritual reality many people today overlook. We chase visibility and affirmation, when what God really uses is faithfulness in hidden places. Integrity in obscurity positions you for influence in visibility. Joseph didn't give up his character just because he was unseen. He lived faithfully whether he was Potiphar's servant or a prisoner. Even when the world forgot him, God didn't. And that consistency, the same integrity in the dark as in the light, made him trustworthy for leadership in one of the greatest seats of power in history. Are you the same person when no one's watching as when everyone sees? Because in the spiritual economy, consistency in obscurity becomes credibility and influence. Your story becomes someone else's lifeline, if you let it. Joseph didn't just rise to prominence for personal glory. When famine struck, his family, the very ones who betrayed him, came to Egypt for food. Joseph stood in a position not to punish, but to provide. That's a radical twist in purpose. The wounded becoming the healer, the betrayed becoming the blessing. This speaks directly to how personal pain can be transformed into empathy and leadership. When you've walked through betrayal, you can comfort others who are betrayed. When you've been overlooked, you can see the overlooked. When you've been rejected, you can invite the rejected. Your past doesn't disqualify you. It equips you for ministry in ways you couldn't have imagined. Delay is not denial. It is divine timing. This is one of the toughest truths to accept in real life. We want answers now. We want resolution on our terms. We want God to show up before the humiliation arrives. But Joseph's life shows that God doesn't rescue too early. He rescues at the right time. That means there is a season between promise and fulfillment that matters just as much. A season where character aligns with calling. That season is not meaningless. It is developmental. If you're in a delay right now, whether in career, purpose, relationships, or internal clarity, Joseph's story says this: God has not forgotten you. He's forming you. That isn't a half-truth. It's the backbone of spiritual confidence in times of uncertainty. Restoration doesn't undo the journey. It honors it. When Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he doesn't wave away the pain. He acknowledges it, but he also repositions it. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That's the transformation, not of circumstances, but of interpretation. Joseph didn't deny the betrayal, he redeemed its meaning. This has immense practical relevance. We aren't called to pretend nothing hurt. We're called to see that what hurt can be used to help others. In your life today, this translates into a posture of redemptive interpretation. The ability to say, I will not let my wound dictate my destiny, but I will let it deepen my compassion. In a world that prizes quick fixes and instant results, Joseph's life stands as a masterclass not in luck, but in endurance, alignment, and faithful presence. Betrayal may knock you off balance, but it doesn't have to knock you out of purpose. Delay may frustrate you, but it doesn't remove you from destiny. Suffering may humble you, but it doesn't disqualify you. Because God doesn't just rescue His people, He remolds them. And that truth transforms how we live, work, love, and lead in the real world. When the blueprint becomes your story. Joseph's journey was not random. It was a carefully constructed narrative, where every betrayal, every delay, every misunderstanding, and every moment of waiting had purpose. This final section shows how his story not only concludes, but calls every one of us to rise from our own pits and live a transformed life. Not in spite of pain, but because of what God can make of it. Joseph's life didn't end with triumph alone. It ended with reconciliation, restoration, and redemption, not just of himself, but of the very ones who betrayed him. That is the heart of his legacy. God doesn't just rescue us from our pain, He uses our pain to save others. And in his final act of reconciliation, Joseph reveals the deepest truth of his story. Victory isn't about being right, it's about being used. So what does that mean for you? Perhaps the first thing worth noticing is that your hardest chapters are not your final chapters. They are part of the design for your destiny. Joseph didn't get stuck in the pit. He didn't end his story in Potiphar's house. He didn't conclude in prison. Each season was a preparation for purpose, not a parking space for defeat. Life rarely gives us instant clarity. More often, wisdom comes in hindsight, and sometimes only after seasons of silence, struggle, and separation. Joseph's greatest revelation that what was meant for harm could be repurposed for good didn't come at the beginning of his story. It came after everything else had been stripped away. Where in your life does pain still outshine purpose? What betrayal still feels raw enough that you haven't yet asked, what might God be writing through this? Because transformation begins not in the blessing, but in the meaning made from what once hurt you. You can't skip that step. You can't shortcut interpretation. You don't get to bypass the days in the pit, the silence in the waiting room, the loneliness in the shadows. They are part of the narrative that shapes your resilience, spiritual muscle, and emotional depth. Here's what begins to happen when you start to see your story through Joseph's lens. You begin to view delay not as denial, but as divine alignment. You see betrayal not just as injury, but as introduction into a larger purpose. You see that every time you reconnect with your calling in the midst of confusion, you inch closer to your fulfillment. Transformation in this sense is not a sudden switch. It is a progressive unveiling. Like the dawn, the nightmare night gives way not to immediate sun, but to slow illumination, and then light. This is why Joseph's story resonates with us so deeply, because it mirrors the experience of the human soul. Waiting, watching, wondering if blessing is truly on the other side of pain. What if your blessing has already met you in the pit, but you have not yet recognized it? Your transformation doesn't begin when everything is perfect. It begins when you start to see your struggle as material in God's workshop. There is another truth Joseph's life teaches us. Restoration doesn't undo the journey. It honors it. When Joseph forgives his brothers, he doesn't erase what happened. He doesn't pretend it didn't hurt. He simply sees it differently, not as a story of rejection, but as the mechanism through which blessing traveled. That is a picture of redemptive memory. The ability to hold your past in one hand, and in the other hand see that God used it to shape your character, your empathy, your influence. The most powerful leaders in Scripture and in history are rarely those who never hurt. They are those who let God heal them, shape them, and send them back out with wisdom born in suffering. That's the transformation call for you today. You don't need to have it all figured out to be used. You don't need your past to be perfect to step into purpose. You don't need external approval to be God-appointed. You just need a heart that says, God, use what I've been through. Use what I thought was a setback. Use what I thought was wasted to bring blessing to others. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you start seeing your story that way, not as a tale of pain, but as a thread in a grand design, you step into a kind of peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away. Joseph became a leader not because he was always right, but because he trusted God long enough for his story to make sense. And that is the invitation before you right now. To trust God with what you've lived through, even when it still doesn't feel like the blessing you hoped it would be. To see your betrayal not as a dead end, but as the bending of a path leading somewhere you've yet to stand. To step forward with the conviction that your narrative isn't over. It's unfolding. And in that unfolds the transformation you didn't even realize you were waiting for.